Sal Khan here. I'm here with Dan Weisberg, who's the CEO of TNTP. Dan, what does TNTP do?
We are a national education nonprofit, Sal. We were founded 23 years ago by teachers, and our mission is to work with schools and school systems to make sure all kids are getting an opportunity to have great experiences in the classroom with great teachers and great teaching.
And what we're looking at, this opportunity myth, this is a report that has gotten a lot of attention. What is the gist of it?
We spent about 3 years on this study trying to get to the root cause of something which is really troubling about the United States education system, which is we got record numbers of kids graduating from high school, which is a good thing. We got record numbers of kids going into college, which is a good thing. We also have record numbers of kids who are realizing when they get to college they're not prepared to do the work, and that's a really bad thing. And so, although we work in K to 12, we really wanted to dig into why this is. Why is it that 40% of college kids have to take remedial courses, even though they've got a high school degree, and 60% of kids of color end up having to take remedial courses, which really puts them off track to get their degree.
And these are the kids who are graduating from high school, going to college, and large chunks are still having to take. And when we say remedial course, we're not talking about 11th grade level. We're usually talking about 7th or 8th grade level.
That's exactly right. I mean, they are not these kids are doing everything we ask them to do through 12th grade, walking across that stage, getting the diploma, cap and gown, going to college, the American dream, and they are not prepared to pass freshman English or freshman math. And that is a hugely troubling thing. And what we found in this study, just to cut to the chase, is it's really not what they're doing. It's what we are not providing to them.
So let's dig into that a little bit. So explain this data we're looking at and how you got this.
Yeah, so as I said, we did a pretty intensive 3-year study where we followed 4,000 kids across 5 different school systems over the course of the 16-17 school year. And one of the things we looked at is 25,000 pieces of student work. And we looked at each one of those 25,000.
I think that deserves some pause. So you looked at 25,000 pieces of student work.
Yes, our incredible team not only looked at them, uploaded them, but rated them about whether the kids were actually meeting the expectations of the assignment. So to put it clearly, were the kids getting at least an 80 on the assignment based on our assessment of the work they did? And then also looking at the grade and content standards for the state they were in and make an assessment about whether the work the kids were doing met those standards. And what you see with this data is overwhelming majority of the time, over 70% of the time, the kids were doing very well on the assignment. They were meeting the expectations of the assignment. The problem is on those exact same assignments, they were only meeting the expectations for state learning standards 17% of the time. And that 54% gap is filled with assignments that just didn't give kids a chance to do grade level work.
So if I understand this correct, and I think that makes a ton of sense, that if a student is 71%, or if these students 71% of the time were doing what the assignments expected, but 17% of the time they were doing what the standards expected of them, that's got to be mainly due to the assignments not being rigorous enough for those students.
Exactly.
Here you have an example. What type of an assignment would this be?
Yeah, so this is, again, we have thousands of these assignments in our data set. So this is an 8th grade English assignment. And kids in this assignment had to read A Mighty Long Way, which is a nonfiction book about the integration effort at Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas. This is an 8th grade level text. And then they had to write an informational essay about the role of the press in this historic integration effort. So this was an assignment that actually was requiring kids to do grade level work and, more to the point, to really do the thinking.
So an 8th grade student seeing this assignment would be getting rigorous grade level appropriate work.
Yes.
And then what is this?
All right, so this is the same district, same basic demographic of kids. We're not cherry picking. Another 8th grade English class. In this case, the kids are being asked to read a very short 5th grade level text and then fill in the vowels to complete the word habitat.
Wow.
And so, here's an example of kids who very likely are getting A's and B's on this assignment, doing very well, bringing home good report cards, but doing this assignment doesn't remotely put them on track to do 8th grade or 9th grade work, much less to graduate high school ready for college. And here's the really heartbreaking punchline, Sal, is for every assignment like that first assignment, there were 3 that we saw like this one. And that's a big part of our problem.
That feeds into this data. Explain what we're seeing here.
And so if you just look at how kids did on the assignments that are at grade level, like the one about the integration effort at Little Rock Central High School.
So the left side of the screen are the percent of students succeeding on grade level assignments.
Exactly right. And here we split out the students of color and white students because we wanted to show that though there is a gap in their level of success, it's a pretty small gap. It's not an overwhelming gap. And the reality is, across all kids, a solid majority of them, when you give them grade level assignments, are meeting the expectations.
And to make sure I understand this, because I think this is the real meat of what you're talking about, if I were to go into a classroom that is mostly students of color, and if I were to give them grade level work, 56% would be successful at it. 56% are ready. And it obviously depends on what grade level work. They might have gaps in different things, but generally speaking, 56. If I were to go into a classroom with mostly white students, 65%. But to your point, they're not that different. They're roughly 2/3, 60% of students in America. If you give them grade level work, they are going to be able to do it, or some grade level work.
Yes, and at least looking at our pretty large data set that looks at kids who are in schools across the country. That's right, and it squares with our general experience. The issue is not that we have kids who are getting overwhelmed by work that's too rigorous for them. We have kids who could handle more rigorous work who aren't getting the opportunity to do it.
And this is actually eerily similar to some of the data that we've started looking at Khan Academy, where we've done some analysis in the classrooms that are using us. And obviously, Khan Academy, it's personalized. Hopefully, what the most rigorous thing that the kids are ready for is what we aim to do, what's in their zone of proximal development. But we know we're not perfect. We're constantly trying to improve recommendations and things like that. But currently, about 2/3 of students on Khan Academy are doing grade level or ahead of grade level work, while 1/3 of them might need to do some gap filling.
Yes, and to be clear, the answer from us is not we need to give all kids grade level work all the time. Not even remotely that. We need to make sure that all kids have the opportunity to get exposure to grade level work. But yeah, there's lots of kids who do have gaps. And what we need to have is really smart strategies and resources of the type that Khan Academy provides to catch kids up. We just have to make sure that when we are giving kids who are behind work that is meeting them where they are, that's in service of getting them up to the success level that they are capable of getting to. It's not a permanent place for them to stay and wallow. And unfortunately, for the vast majority of our kids, and particularly our kids from lower income families and our kids of color, they are getting work that is pegged too low.
And that's what this right side of your slide here says.
Yeah, so if you look at the classrooms that had predominantly kids of color that we were collecting those thousands and thousands of assignments from, almost 40% of those classrooms, when we were collecting the assignments, had no assignments at grade level, 0. So those kids, when we were there, weren't getting any opportunity or any exposure to grade appropriate assignments. Whereas if you look at the classrooms...
And I want to stop there because that's a strong statement. There's one thing to say that maybe 40% weren't fully on grade level.
Right.
You're not saying that. You're saying that 40% did not see one assignment in 180 school days.
Yeah. Now, to be clear, we weren't there for 180 school days, but we were there for a good chunk of the year. And, we also spent a lot of time in thousands of classrooms across the country. And the reality is, this is not the exception. There are plenty of classrooms, again, particularly those that are serving kids, low-income kids, kids of color, kids with mild to moderate disabilities, kids for whom English is not the first language, who don't get a chance all year.
And I could imagine if you made the threshold even slightly higher, saying, 20% of grade level material or 30% was grade level material, then you'd be talking about much higher numbers than 38. So it's despite the fact that roughly 60% of those kids are ready for grade level material a lot of the time.
Exactly.
Maybe not all the time, but a lot of the time.
Exactly.
And that compares to classrooms
Yes.
with mostly white students where it's very unusual. And actually, these might be some of the less affluent.
That's right. That's right. Obviously, there are classrooms with that are predominantly white kids that have low income kids for sure. So that could be what you're picking up here. But the reality is, I mean, it's far less common to see in those classrooms serving white kids that they're not going to get any opportunity to do grade level work.
Clearly, for those kids who are that 56% of students of color who are ready for grade level work, they need to be seeing grade level work. Some of them are probably ready for ahead of grade level work, but they're not even getting grade level.
That's right.
So you got to give them that. But what about for the other 44% of students who weren't necessarily going to be successful on arbitrary grade level work?
Yeah, so this is really the critical piece about the so what. All right, we get why this is important. Now, what do we do about it? You need to have really smart strategies for those kids who are not ready to do grade level work to catch them up and not catch them up, years and years from now. But a lot of those kids will make quantum leaps in 1 year if they are getting the right kind of resources to fill in the gaps, if we understand what their gaps are, and all the adults around them have the same mission, which is to get them up to success level.
Right, because the big takeaway here is if students had, even these students who are behind grade level according to assessments, if they had better assignments, which according to this presentation is grade level assignments, they are growing dramatically.
Yes.
And also you have similar effects when you have stronger instruction or higher expectations. Which is a little bit counterintuitive because some folks might say, well, those kids, even though they're eighth graders, they're operating at a fifth grade level. Let's just make them do fifth grade work.
Yes.
And this speaks to the fact, they're eighth graders now. They're cognitively more mature. It's not like they don't know anything from fifth, sixth, seventh grade. If you give them the eighth grade material, they will be able to engage on some of it and grow. Ideally, they also are given opportunities to fill gaps.
Yes. And so part of what's represented here, I want to really pause to point out. So we did have classrooms where kids who were well behind the average were getting some access to grade appropriate assignments. The reason most of the time they were getting that is because they had outstanding teachers who were working really hard to catch these kids up. And the way they were working hard to catch these kids up is making sure those kids had definite supports. Maybe they were reading text to them. Maybe they were given a little longer to do some of the work, but they were catching them up so they could do the most rigorous work because those teachers understood that those kids were capable of doing it if you filled their gaps. So, the reason we know this can be different, like our world can be different in our public education system, is because we've got great teachers who are doing it right now. Like, this is not something that we haven't seen before. This slide represents a lot of great teachers doing a lot of great work with kids who, frankly, a lot of the systems have given up on.
And this slide, I want to stay on it because I think at least a superficial read of it could maybe build a tension between what you're saying and what I often talk about, which is personalized learning. Because one takeaway that I could have here, or someone could have, is like, all right, let's give grade level assignments to everyone, maybe no matter what. A lot of what I talk about, and we talk a lot about it, Khan Academy, and all of our resources are put against our belief, and we have a lot of evidence to think that is, especially in things like mathematics, although I think it happens in all subjects, is it's cumulative, and you get an 80% in exponents. You didn't know 20% of the material. You get a 70% in negative numbers, and then all of a sudden in algebra class, 2 years later, you see an equation that has negative numbers and exponents, and you have those gaps, and it's hard to engage in the algebra. And so what we a lot of times advocate for is do what's in the student's zone of proximal development. We're seeing for 2/3 of students, it's stuff that's grade level, sometimes even ahead of grade level. And for some students, it might be go off grade level because that's the most rigorous thing they need to fill in their gaps so they can do more rigorous stuff. Is there a tension? Are these fighting words that
Yeah, I'm so glad you raised this, Sal, because there really isn't a tension. So it's the wrong lesson to draw from this data and from our work that we need to make sure all kids, regardless of their starting point, need to be working on nothing but grade appropriate assignments all the time. So one thing to know is our quote unquote best classrooms, the kids were only getting grade appropriate assignments half the time, leaving and those are the kids, by the way, who are zooming ahead that you see on the left side of this slide, leaving plenty of time for exactly what you're talking about, filling gaps, doing review, doing remediation, goofing off, whatever it is that a great teacher is going to decide to do. So you shouldn't take an absolutist view of this at all. But on the other side of the equation, you should certainly be concerned, as I know you would be concerned, if you had kids day after day after day after day getting no exposure to really challenging work that wasn't moving them ahead, and that unfortunately is too often the story.
Yeah, the form of remediation where you're an eighth grader, you're testing at a fifth grade level, we're essentially going to make you take fifth grade over again.
Yes.
And a lot of that stuff is going to be way too easy for that student.
Right.
A good personalization system would not do that.
And I even go a half step further, because what our folks out in the field will tell you is that what we most desperately need is resources of the type, and I'm not just saying this because I'm sitting next to you, that Khan Academy provides, which is, really smart, really engaging, gap-filling resources for kids. Because this is what teachers are demanding. And this is the potential power of personalization. It's a huge equity tool. In other words, if each kid is getting what he or she really needs, then it doesn't matter whether the kid's behind, the kids are ahead, the kids on grade level. They're getting what they need, all in service of making sure when they walk across that stage with the cap and gown and get the high school diploma, they are ready.
What I'm finding really interesting about this conversation is it's becoming increasingly clear that not only is there not tension between what we're saying, but we are actually saying the exact same thing. This right over here is a slide that I often present to folks when we're describing how Khan Academy can be used in a classroom. And what we recommend is for, let's say, 4 days a week, students are getting whole class grade level instruction, and there Khan Academy assignments can be used to ensure that kids get as much practice as they need, they get immediate feedback, teachers immediately know what they're working on, when they're working on it. These assignments are standardized to the true standards, so we don't have to worry about them being watered down. And then for, let's say, 20% of the week, the students are able to go into personalized learning, where if they have gaps, they're able to fill them in. But if they don't have gaps, they're able to continue at grade level work or even accelerate. And so if you do something like this, you're getting the best of both worlds, which is exactly what you're saying. We just want all students at their zone of proximal development. If we give, I think you said, at least 50% of grade level instruction, here what we've been recommending is actually 80% of grade level instruction, but you also need some way to personalize and fill in any gaps if you have them.
Yes, well said.
And what's this?
So this may be particularly relevant for Khan Academy. So this is looking at grading, at course grades, because one of the things we're very fortunate to have for our 4,000 kids is and their peers is all of their course grades and their test scores. And so what it shows is, first of all, big divergence between the signals kids and families are getting on their report cards versus how they're doing on standardized tests, which is probably a debate for a different day.
So let me make sure I'm reading this correctly. So if amongst students who are, say getting a B, the students of color getting a B are not doing as well on the 3rd through 8th grade standardized tests as the white students getting a B. So that would imply that the B in the student of color's classroom is a lower standard.
Correct.
And we're seeing that same notion if you use the SAT, ACT to measure. And this is really interesting on AP tests. It's actually the most stark.
Yes.
That there in AP classes where predominantly students of color are taking it, they're doing exactly what they're told. They're in the AP class, they get an A, but only looks like 30-something% of them are able to get a 3 or higher. So we're not even saying a 5.
That's right.
Are able to get a 3 or higher, which means that this is a super watered down AP course.
Yes.
For the white students, of the ones that got an A, close to 80% are getting a 3 or higher, essentially passing the AP test. So once again, they have a much higher standard. And this is the takeaway, I guess, is it's just unfair to these kids. They're doing exactly what they're told, and then they're shocked by the standardized test because no one ever exposed them that rigor. This is actually really interesting because it's consistent with some of the survey data we've seen. We've surveyed students going to college, and we asked a simple question: has Khan Academy had a meaningful impact on your education? And 60% of all students, surprisingly, I was surprised by the numbers, said it had, and they said, Khan Academy was there that night that I was confused in by stoichiometry or whatever. But among students who were first in their family to go to college, which I think correlates with a lot of the students of color in this case, they said that Khan Academy was that tutor that their family couldn't afford to fill in their gaps. That's another point. The affluent kids are doing mastery learning. They're getting tutors.
Yes.
And what these kids told us is this was the tutor their family couldn't afford, but especially the students who took things like AP classes, Khan Academy had the level of rigor that is actually measured not just on AP tests, but actually in college. So they cited having access to that level of rigorous materials as a reason that Khan Academy had a meaningful impact on their education.
Which is, a stunning thing on the impact that you're having on first-generation college students. I mean, it's terrific. You would like to have a world where they were getting that level of rigor all day in their AP class, and then maybe getting rigor where they needed it from Khan Academy. What we're seeing here is that, first of all, a racialized kind of two-tiered expectation standard in grading, but what you're also seeing is kids getting false signals about their preparedness, and that is hugely important because we've seen some research done by some other organizations, parents not surprisingly, and probably students too, they put more confidence in the report cards than they do in test scores. And so, here are a bunch of kids who are doing, as you say, everything we ask them, taking AP classes, which we want our kids to take rigorous classes, college-level classes in high school. They're getting A's and B's in those classes, presumably thinking that they're ready to do college-level work, but the reality is when you look at the test scores, they're not. And then, on top of that, you look at the fact that, as you say, it's particularly stark when you look at the AP graph, that a kid of color getting an A has a lesser chance of passing the AP exam than a white kid getting a C. There's something seriously wrong with that picture.
And so here's just information for folks who want to learn more about all of this incredible work you've been doing. What's your nirvana? What do you think are next steps? How do you think we should work together? What's your advice for Khan Academy?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have all the answers by any stretch. So we're in learning mode just like everybody else. What I think is important and really connects to the conversation that we're having, Sal, is we all ought to be focused not so much on the inputs, what decisions are we making at a central level or state level, but what are kids actually experiencing? That is hugely, hugely important. And what are their goals, and to what extent are what the experiences we're giving them helping them to reach those goals? That should be the center of everything that we do. And for the most part, we're flying blind. Like, we don't have a window into what kids are experiencing in school and classrooms. That's something we can change. The other piece that I think is really important, that's a principle that's guiding our work, is let's think of students and their families as a huge critical resource. As we're trying to figure out as policymakers and practitioners, hey, how do we make sure kids are getting the best quality of education? Let's make sure we're connecting to kids and families. And for one thing, the one thing we can stop doing right away is let's stop misleading them and lying, because we know that is having a destructive effect, and it also shows tremendous disrespect, particularly for communities of color. So let's shift that dynamic, because I think once you start asking kids, really to tell us things, that they're not going to have all the answers, but you're going to open up a huge world, really rich information that's going to help you be a lot better as an educator, as an elected official, as a sport organization.
Some of the takeaways I've had from this conversation are resources like Khan Academy. One of their points of value is that clear signal that we can provide of what is truly grade appropriate and how you truly are faring on it. As we talked about a few minutes ago, you could be in a classroom, let's say an AP calculus classroom, that's super watered down, has low expectations, But if you can have access to a platform like Khan Academy, you will see what the actual expectations are and how you are actually faring it well before you take something like an AP exam or you go to college and have a shock. I think there's another measure of this information, this instrumentation of what's actually happening at the classroom. Because in a lot of education, the conversation's happening at a very high level. Which textbook do we pick? What are the standards? The pacing guides, et cetera, et cetera. But then how does that actually translate to the day-to-day student experience? And I think there might be worlds where we can help districts understand even things like student engagement. And then there's this third dimension that I've taken away. I'm hearing give everyone the most rigorous material that is most likely to accelerate their learning. And what we're hearing is that it's grade level material for some of the time for most of the kids, and it is time to fill in gaps for probably all students some of the time. And that personalization actually can do both. Personalization can give gap filling, it can give grade level, and it can give acceleration. And in some ways, our stats are eerily similar to some of what you've seen.
Yes, and I would just say, like, keep on keeping on, because as you saw when you engage with first generation college students, look, we hope to get to a point where every kid in every classroom is getting really engaging, challenging, rich, relevant work all the time. And, we got educators working really hard on that every day. But in the meantime, where that's not the experience for the vast majority of kids, what you're providing, just like those first gen college students, is kind of a lifeline. It is free access to the type of work that they want to master in order to reach their goal, and that they need to master in order to succeed at the next level. So it's critically important right now. It really is.
Thanks, Dan. This was super informative.
Thank you, Sal. Appreciate it.